Good afternoon and welcome to CBM Calling. My name is Terry Smith and I am on this call from Toronto, Canada. And it's 2:30 in the afternoon where I am. But I have stirred two very dear friends out of their potential slumber and invited them to join me on what I believe might be one of the most dire conversations that we're going to have on CBM Calling as we look at the intersection between COVID-19 and global poverty. Estimates are that the health and economic impact of COVID-19 could turn back the clock on 10 to 15 years of progress in reducing global poverty, and that hundreds of millions of people, the numbers are staggering, hundreds of millions of people can be pushed back into poverty. People who had been emerging out of poverty because of the good work that governments and NGOs had been involved in. This afternoon, I am super honored to welcome two very special guests and dear friends. Our first guest is with us from Colombo, Sri Lanka. Roshan Mendis is the head of operations for Asia Pacific Baptist Aid. Roshan, we welcome you to our call. Roshan is also the CEO of a Sri Lankan NGO called LEADS, which is an organization committed to community development, relief and rehabilitation, advocacy, and a term that is used in Sri Lanka called social harmony, which we in Canada might refer to as peace and reconciliation. I am very grateful for the work that Roshan has done for God's church around the world. He served as the head of operations also for BMS in Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and India for a number of years. He has addressed the Australian Parliament, talking about the Millennium Development Goals. Roshan is a lay pastor and very committed to the work and worship in his own local church. And Roshan, you were awarded one of the highest awards of the Sri Lankan government for your work around the tsunami relief and rehabilitation work. Roshan is married to Priya, and they have a son, Navneth. Our second guest is with us from Didcot in the United Kingdom. Steve Sanderson is the Deputy Director of Mission for BMS, and Steve, inasmuch, heads up the overseas operations. BMS works in 30 countries around the world and with 67 partners. I know that, Steve, that your work involves global development, relief, justice, and health ministries. You worked with BMS in Uganda. You've also worked in Rwanda, Tanzania, and Kenya. Steve's background is a lawyer, and he has also a degree in economic development and in Reformation history, which is a rather odd pair. Some other day, Steve, you can tell me about that combination. He works on the board of a number of charities, and he oversees the strategic development and strategy of BMS and working with their partners. But what I loved about your bio, Steve, is that you said the hardest task that you have is to be the father of three preteen children. So I'm sure that you and Caroline, with your good negotiation skills, can manage that. Let me begin by asking the two of you, how are you guys coping where you are? What's life like for you during self-isolation? Roshan?
It's been a strange experience having been locked down from around the second week of March. It's been a pretty stringent lockdown that we've had here, and it's only around this week that there is some return to work in offices, but that's not for everybody. So it's been quite tight, and the good thing about the situation is that community spread has been contained as at now. So we're looking at a positive situation coming up in the future. But definitely it has changed our lives around and given us more time together as a family as well, as quite apart from the changes in working environment.
Thank you. I forgot to mention, Roshan, that it's so kind of you to join us because I think it's midnight for you in Sri Lanka. So
a little after. Yeah.
A little after midnight. Steve, how are things for you and Caroline and the kids?
Yeah, thanks, Terry. I mean, it's a challenge, right? So I'm not sure how things are in Canada, but schools are closed here. Everybody's working from home. And by far the biggest challenge is in COVID-19 responding is trying to educate the kids because neither of us have the slightest gift when it comes to teaching.
Oh my gosh, I can empathize with you. My wife is a grade 6 French immersion teacher, and she said that nothing in her career ever equipped her to try to teach grade 6 children online. So I can relate to that. I introduced our conversation by saying that we are facing a crisis upon a crisis, and that the global pandemic of COVID-19 is having a profound impact on poverty around the world. Tell me what you're both hearing from your partners and the agencies that you are associated with. What is happening at that intersection of poverty and COVID-19?
I think I might pick that up. There is a huge challenge, particularly to the levels of poverty further being impacted by COVID. And that, I think, would be the greatest disaster of what's going on at this point. When I look at some of the situations, like, for example, in the Philippines with so many migrant workers, the lack of remittances back home, their lack of access to go back to their work from the Middle East, in Europe, places like that, which has reduced the amount of cash that these people have, has impacted them in terms of food security. I was speaking to one construction chap this morning, and he was talking about the fact that now he's beginning to feel the pinch in terms of money available to him and his family. They did not quite realize the impacts of this, that it was going to be, 3 weeks without access to any shops or anything like that. So how were they going to get their food? And so a lot of challenges. We have situations with pastors that are bivocational, facing challenges in their income. We've had to look at situations of bailing them out. Schools, Christian schools that are impacted because there is no fees coming into schools any longer because there are no children, and the question of whether you can ethically charge those fees. And, the figures are staggering because Save the Children actually has put out the figures that around 22 to 33 million children will be pushed into poverty by the economic consequences of COVID. And, the situations of various industries being shut down, the sugar industry in the Philippines, the farmers in India, the food industry is impacting even imports out of the country. Other countries are being impacted by that. Indonesia, the coffin makers are struggling to cope with the demand because there are so many barriers and they cannot cope with that. In places like where the garment industry is in Bangladesh, again, there's a huge impact. So all over, we see this kind of scenario which is going on, and people are really finding it a challenge.
Yeah. Every one of those cases that you describe have an unbelievable impact on not hundreds or even thousands, but tens of thousands of individuals because
Millions.
of the interconnected nature of a global economy, and millions of people, of course. Yes, absolutely. Oh, thank you, Roshan. Steve, what are you hearing?
Something pretty similar to Roshan, really. I suppose what we have within our own partnerships around the world is you hear partners coming back and saying, actually, where we have sustainability models that are built in, that are based around local market, that market just isn't there. You're involved, for example, in hospitals in parts of Africa that rely upon a fee basis from people attending the hospitals. They just aren't coming because they're afraid of catching COVID-19 in a hospital. Roshan mentioned a situation in India as well. They had a situation in Delhi where really overnight the economy was closed down. People were told stay indoors. And you had upwards of 15 million people around the wider Delhi area who are informal laborers who were told, there is no work here, no point in arriving in the street and competing for work. And neither can the state provide for you. So we have partners that were feeding up to 42,000 people with food parcels alongside the police who were just completely spending out their budgets to meet that immediate need. Long since spent out, problem still remains. And so now they're reporting back these stories of we just have no means to do it. We have people that are starving. We have people who really have no form of income whatsoever. So there is that whole kind of diminution of the global economy, which has enormous, obviously, kind of knock-on effects at a kind of a global systemic level. But really, as ever, the poorest of the poor within the more marginalized countries are the ones who really kind of fall below that resilience line.
Oh, yeah. Boy, we're going to come back to that question of vulnerability in a moment and who are the most vulnerable, but I really appreciate how clearly the two of you have described the urgency of this situation right now. The United Nations Human Development Index is a useful tool for those of us who work in the relief and development sector. And the UNHDI says that human development is very different than just economic development. It focuses on three key components to help ensure, to move people towards wellness. And I think that we as Christians would add a fourth. The three things that the HDI identify are a long and a healthy life. Secondly, education and knowledge. And the third is a decent standard of living. As I pointed out, we as Christians would say that standing in a right relationship with our Maker through Jesus Christ is a pretty important and vital, indispensable element of the well-roundedness of our completeness as Christ, as God's creation. My question is for you is, how does human development suffer as a result of COVID? Obviously, health is affected for millions of people, but more than just health, isn't it? What are some of the other impacts that are happening?
Shall I lead with that one, Terry?
Yeah, go for it. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So even if you take the Human Development Index, you kind of jump off from the education question, and again, one of the kind of challenges I was expressing our own challenges in home educating, but really it's nothing. Whereas in the West we have great access to technology, great interconnectedness, and so by and large we can still continue to educate children at the present time. Really those options are not there in a lot of the developing world. However long lockdown lasts for, that relates to an educational gap that exists. I think you then step into some of these kind of questions about safe spaces for children, which is kind of certainly an area of expertise that Roshan holds. And of course, you do begin to see those areas of abuse emerge in terms of domestic violence, child abuse, etc., etc. So I think there are kind of great concerns around the rights dimension of human development, particularly on the education side. I think you refer to the health aspect as well. I mean, very obviously, there's going to be an enormous reduction in crude death rate because of COVID-19 globally. But I was just reading the WHO report on which was released a few weeks ago in relation to Africa, and they talk about a 22% infection rate across the continent, which is likely to exist for the next 3 to 4 years. And so you consider the disease burden within Africa already. The amount of time that takes people out of work in terms of being ill, to say nothing of the mortality rate, to say nothing of the pressure it puts on already fragile health systems. And of course, that then has an economic downward spiral too. So really there's a lot that's kind of, stacked against the more vulnerable places in the world because of the disease burden that COVID-19 will continue to present. And as we know, whoever arrives at the vaccine first, you can bet your bottom dollar that it's going to be Western Europe, North America, that will have the first round of vaccinations. It may be 4 or 5 years before vaccines start to hit the rest of the world.
Absolutely. Yeah. What do you see, Roshan?
Yeah. To add to what Steve is saying, when we look at the figures, the UNDP report, for example, talks about 500 million people that are going to be pushed back into poverty. A setback of almost 20 years in terms of the development that we have come up to right now. And those on the underside are the ones that are most affected. And like Steve was saying, the impact on education, and particularly with the challenge in families with girl children. Again, UNICEF has put out figures of 740 million girls that might be forced out of education because of the pandemic. And the impact of that is on the fact of, what are the fathers going to do with these girls in the household? The chances of trafficking, abuse, gender violence against women is huge, and particularly in some of our nations, where this is part of the problem that we have in particularly some of the northern countries, northern states of India and Nepal and places like that, where trafficking is high. This is a huge challenge. The pandemic is spreading where, in places, if you look at it now, in the poorest of the countries. And, if development is going to go back 20 years, you can just imagine the impacts, the ripple effects of that on everything else. And because we don't have social nets to be able to hold these communities, there is nothing that they can depend upon. They will depend upon what the governments give, and the governments will often give based on either political bias or on ethnicity or some kind of bias of that nature. It's not going to be something that is distributed even-handedly. And so obviously you're going to have, again, that effect and that impact on the poor there. On top of that, as I've mentioned to you, Terry, I think some time ago, we are just the 1040 window of disasters as well. And, we just have had, 2 disasters hit in this area just over the last 2 weeks. And, that's going to further impact this whole scenario of the COVID and the impact on the poor. So it's a huge, complex issue and multi-sectoral. It's not just about health we are talking about. It's huge.
Absolutely. I remember reading a couple of weeks ago in The Economist magazine a piece that Bill Gates wrote, and in his article he said that when the history of the COVID-19 pandemic is written at some point in the future, what we have lived up until this point may take only the first third of the book. That what lies ahead, specifically in the global south, in terms of education and healthcare and agriculture and economic development, the impact of COVID-19 and its kind of far-reaching and complex devastation it still will be. We haven't even started seeing how this is going to be played out, and it really does alert us. And those of us that work in Baptist Relief and Development, it alerts us to the importance of the work that we're all involved in. Steve, you've used a couple times in our conversation already the word vulnerable, most vulnerable. And I wonder if I could ask you just to kind of expand on that a wee bit. Who do you feel right now are the most vulnerable in the world?
Yeah, thank you, Terry. You do read this stuff, you do hear from partners, you do hear kind of what's happening on the ground in places of greater vulnerability than perhaps we have in the Western world. And you do hear some absolutely heartbreaking stories. I think news probably is coming through in Canada as it has been in the UK about some of the refugee camps in Yemen, for example, where they're beginning to dig mass graves, really, because of course you have that perfect storm situation of people in close proximity with no ability to socially distance, with extraordinary levels of reduced immunity, and with that as well, the possibility of kind of entering into those sort of environments with adequate healthcare, the necessary healthcare required is very limited, and so we're beginning to see some quite large mortality rates within some of those intense refugee camps. So I think of course you'd be concerned about South Sudanese refugees in northern Uganda. You'd be concerned as well about some of the refugee camps around Jordan, Syria, northern Iraq, Lebanon, as well as some of the stuff that's happening in southern Europe and Greece. I would say, however, you touched on it, and Roshan touched on it as well. All of that kind of presents an immediate kind of public health question. I think almost what's emerging now is that bigger question about global recession, and just that whole kind of structural setback in terms of development. And again, when you step into some of those lowest Human Development Index ranked countries, vast majority are in sub-Saharan Africa, and you begin to realize actually you've had informal economy that's been tied off for a couple of months, people struggling to survive within that. You have an absence of foreign direct investment that's going to come because of increased fear around the disease burden within Africa, reduced man hours, woman hours, work hours, whatever you want to call it. I think plus as well as that reduction of tax and the inability to provide fundamental services that allow people to flourish and thrive. I can see all of that being rolled back, as you rightly say, by 10 or 15 years, all the way back to kind of, the midpoint of the Millennium Development Goals. Again, you've got to look at what's happening in China, but really India to a much greater extent. Most of the gains within the Millennium Development Goals were made in terms of economic growth within those two countries, China and India. I think in India particularly, you're going to see an enormous kind of rollback of economic growth, which is a concern for that whole kind of South Asia region.
Let me pick up on that point. One of the issues that you would know very well, Roshan, is from your work in Asia, is the prevalence of urbanization and the impact of urbanization on health and economic development. I think of those great cities that Steve has just referred to in India, and the densely populated urban slums that are so visible in places like Kolkata, and we work extensively in Hyderabad, for example, and other Chennai, Madras. What is happening? What are you hearing about urban slums and the impact of COVID-19?
Yeah, I think one of the myths of modernization is that urbanization is the answer to or the root of development, and I would strongly disagree with that. And like we when we talk about vulnerable, as Steve was saying, some segments of society are very visibly vulnerable, like as you were talking about the refugees. But then you have the other segments, like those living in urban slums, that seem to be okay, seemingly, but actually are the hidden vulnerable. And global attention does not reach those places, and nor do services reach those places as they would where the vulnerable are far more visible. And in these communities, just as much of congestion and inability for social distancing and lack of hygiene and health and water and sanitation facilities in these places just again aggravate and make them even more vulnerable and perhaps at risk of contagion of COVID in those kinds of situations. And the fact that even their homes, and some of them are literally homeless or are not in homes of their own, in some kind of makeshift shelter, that again adds to that whole situation. So within this context of COVID, and some of the conversations that we've had with some of these people living in that, the responses that we've had, one of the things that we've seen is a significant drop in their household incomes, because a lot of them are daily wage earners and they don't have any other means of income. So there's a huge impact on their daily wages. Those who have engaged in casual or agricultural kind of livelihoods and in the urban areas are actually the hardest hit, much more than the rural poor.
Yeah.
And in that sense, a lot of them are coming back home empty-handed. They don't have the remittances that they would normally depend upon, and haven't realized that their lives are dependent on this kind of daily income and never envisaged a situation of this nature. Self-employed people like tailors, like, small market traders, people who, go around in little carts, trading goods or just carrying them for others. Those simple tasks even cannot be performed. And so, the risk of the economy and food security is the highest around this group that depend on cash for their daily needs.
Yes. Yeah. Believe it or not, I just got a pop-up on my computer screen, a news update about Cyclone Amphan and about the devastation that struck the Sea of Bengal yesterday and the countries of Bangladesh and West Bengal, the city of Kolkata, the devastation that has happened there just since the cyclone struck. In the northern region of the state of Odisha, which is a state where CBM has extensive work. We've heard about the scores of dead people that have been left in the wake of this cyclone. Roshan, maybe my question's a little too early. I don't know if you've been able to be in contact with any of the partners of Asia Pacific Baptist Aid, or have you been able to hear anything that you can report to us?
Yeah, we have been in contact. So thankfully, though this is a Category 5 hurricane in terms of the comparison, and is similar to what hit the same region in 1990, which was a super typhoon and killed so many thousands of people. The death rate is relatively low. It's only around 87 as of today. And we know that 5 of those individuals were from our own congregations, Baptist congregations, in some of those churches in those areas. And we have situations in which the damage to their livelihoods is one of the biggest challenges that they're having. Their farms, the embankments to keep out the water, the fish ponds which they are working on, infrastructure, their houses. And I've been in touch with our partners, and we're having the numbers coming through. And definitely there is a need to rebuild. There is a need for, recovery. And, for us, it was a challenge to consider, are we going to make a second appeal even after, making an appeal for COVID? But this is a double disaster, because even as we think of Odisha and the people there, of the provinces that were affected, I think 13 or at least a significant number were the red zones anyway for COVID. And so, again, some of those people, the migrants that we saw coming from Delhi, were coming to Odisha and to Kolkata from Mumbai and places like that. And those people now have been stopped in their tracks, literally. And, their families are, all over scattered. So we have that kind of scenario in which this is two emergencies that we are having at the moment, which we can actually combine, because anyway, food security is one of those things. And of course, the repair for houses. I've been having news of Cox's Bazar. It's been, spared what we thought we were going to see in that sense. But then the kind of conditions that Steve was talking about, and the scenario there in which, so many people are packed into such a small square area of land, is another issue that will come up. So really measures are also actually hampered because of the COVID, and we are having certain people refusing to go there, even government officials refusing to go there. There is a lack of shelters because of social distancing. And so, for example, in Odisha, I got an update to say that they need 250 more shelters than what they already had. Schools and churches of our Baptist community have been used for shelters, but there again, there is a challenge. The storm is affecting all of what's going on. The complications, of the migrant labor, the health issues in the current situation, and I think also the protection issues are some of the challenges that they're facing. So that's some of the updates that we've heard from there over these last 24 hours.
Well, thank you so much. I think that one of the reasons that more lives weren't taken is because within about a 48-hour period of time, governments were able to move approximately 500,000 people away from coastal communities.
That's right.
But you can imagine that those 500,000 people on a march away from the coast were people who had been previously living in isolation because of COVID-19. And so suddenly now you have this massive migration of people. And so you can only wonder how one problem is superimposed on another.
And if you look at some of the photographs coming out of the shelters, social isolation, social distancing is really not practical. It's an impossibility, and the culture doesn't allow it either. The scenario doesn't allow it either.
Well, I'm going to bring this to a bit of a conclusion and ask you both for a sign of hope. We have described on this call how 20 years of gains in terms of reduction of poverty seems to be wiped away because of COVID-19. And currently, the NGOs, the Christian mission organizations, humanitarian agencies, and governments are going to have to work particularly hard in order to return to perhaps the levels that we were in January of 2020. Hopefully not 20 years. But as we look at the hope that lies ahead, where do you both see a sign of hope? Steve, why don't you go first? Where do you see, in the midst of this darkness and brokenness, where are you seeing some hope?
Yeah, great question. Let's be honest, it's very hard. Certainly when it comes to kind of the Global South question, I don't want to sound overly pessimistic, but I struggle to see how we make those gains back. I suppose probably what I do see a little bit more of is maybe within the Western church, within Western society as a whole, maybe that moment where we stop and we say, actually, unlimited economic growth, unlimited economic consumption, endless expansion of globalization, and a fundamental trust in science and economics probably are unraveling. Mm-hmm. And instead into that mix, I would hope that people begin to say, okay, this is the first kind of major humanitarian issue that people in the West have faced for probably 75 years. Whether they stop and they say, okay, now we get it, let's stand in solidarity from a position of wealth and privilege to then both share that as well as to advocate very strongly to their governments to respond to the challenges in the Global South. Or whether they simply say we have enough problems of our own, let's just shut up shop and do absolutely nothing. I think my absolute prayer and hope would be that it's the former, and actually that we see some sense of reform within the West that in turn enables a more equitable engagement in globalization, a more equitable engagement in both trade and aid going forward.
Thank you, Steve. Roshan? You're muted, I think, Roshan. You're muted, Roshan. Thank you.
Yeah. The need for advocacy is definitely something that's very important. And I would say, one of the reflections that I heard about the COVID was the fact that the reason for this to happen as it has been the fact that there is so much of interconnectedness globally with migrant labor and travel and all of that. But at the same time, a rising nationalism in our nations, which isolates us from each other and doesn't help us to work together. So that's almost kind of a dismal situation. But I would think, the church is a community of hope. And that, for me, is in this context, is something that, we can always look to the church to be that community of hope, because people are asking questions of life and questions about death, questions about meaning. And it's the church that can provide that answer. And I believe that is a tremendous opportunity that God has allowed in this whole context for us to serve in the midst of that. And as Martin Luther said, serve your sick neighbor way back when Johann Hess asked him whether they should leave when the time of the plague hit Germany at that time. And he said, serve your sick neighbor because you would see Christ in him. And that is the kind of call that we have as a community, to be able to serve in that spirit of hope. And also when I look at scripture and I see the examples in which the people of God were in isolation, either by, as an act of God, in a sense, by being sent into exile, or by choice. There may be people like Jacob who, sought shelter in the house of Laban. But in all of those situations, as we look at the patriarchs, the kings, the prophets, the apostles, in all of those instances of isolation, it was always a mark of a change. It marked a new beginning for each one of them, for each of those individuals or those nations that were caught in that context. And I believe that this is, in that sense, a time for that. And as somebody said, the hindsight is something that we'll be able, when we look back upon this, be able to see that what God has been doing, even though we may not see it right now.
Thank you, both of you, for those eloquent and powerful words. We hold to the hope that God is at work in healing a broken and a very sick world, that he is using his church. For a change, the church can't gather in a building. The church is never more the church than we are living out our faith in word and deed in the world. And this is a time when we, as God's people, are able to do it, and particularly care for the most vulnerable. I want to thank Roshan from Asia Pacific Baptist Aid and Leeds in Sri Lanka, Steve Sanderson from BMS in the UK. I'm so grateful for the experience and wisdom and eloquence that you've both brought to this very important conversation. Tomorrow on CBM Calling, we are going to have an interesting conversation, I'm sure. We'll be discussing our understanding of how churches are relating to COVID-19. And it's going to be around with two American pastors who are living here in Canada and having their observations on the state of church and gathering in the States and here in Canada. Thank you again, Roshan and Steve. God bless you both. I wish you both a good night's sleep where you are. And to our listeners, carry on with a great rest of the day. Thank you both. Bye-bye.